Now I'm going to introduce John Harvey, who's the new Managing Director of the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation. John came to Rurdoch from the Grains R&D Corporation, and the R&D corporations in Australia are an enormous part of its future and an enormous part of successes to date. So it's really pleasing that the RDCs are heavily engaged in this couple of days, these 3 days, because they are the driver of innovation. They are the ones that can fund the ideas that we see a lot of farmers develop. And I chaired the cotton one for a long time, and it was one of the most powerful things we ever saw was a bunch of farmers in a paddock arguing with a bunch of researchers, and it was always a very robust conversation. And don't worry, those researchers gave as good as they got, but they got heaps. So please welcome John Harvey.
Thanks, Mike, and can I just say welcome to GrowAg on behalf of the Rurdoch board and also on behalf of the Rurdoch staff. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the enormous amount of work that's gone into preparing for this event, and in particular I'd like to acknowledge Jen Medway and Maxine Kerr. For those of you that know what Rurdoch's been up to, last week we had the Rural Women's Awards in Canberra, and Jen and Max were very much involved in organising that, and I just want to say, look, congratulations on organising yet another event within a week. Well done. I'd also like to acknowledge Sefton's. Sefton's also were in Canberra last week helping us with the Rural Women's Awards. So again, I don't know quite how you've done it, but you've managed to pull off 2 events in a very short period of time, and thank you. It's been fantastic working with you. Just listening to Mike talk made me think about when I first started out in agriculture, and I hope there's some people here that were born in the 80s. Don't show hands. But in the 80s I was based up on the Darling Downs, and it was fascinating watching the Downs at that particular time in the grains industry, because the technology in those days was to plough the guts out of your land. And there was a couple of farmers out at Gundawindi that thought this was crazy, it's using a lot of fuel, it's expensive, got to be a better way. And there was a couple of chemical reps, particularly from ICI in those days. Do you remember ICI? Anyway, ICI, and they decided that there was a better way using sprays, and they started experimenting with no-till and reduced till. The interesting thing about it was watching the neighbours and watching the people over the fence looking and thinking, these guys have got to be mad, they've got to go on crazy. And of course you look back today and it was one of the real breakthroughs in terms of technology. But those couple of growers that stood up, and the regional agronomist that was in the area that said, let's give it a go, and the chemical rep that stood up and said, we're going to put our reputations on the line and give this a try. That was what leadership was about. It was about doing something different, and it was about being prepared to take a risk and being prepared to wear the consequences. But to be frank, they would never have done it on their own. They would never have done it if they'd done it as a lone soldier. It was the fact that they formed a little small group and they supported each other through that process. So that maybe there's some lessons there back from the 80s about innovation and how we do it. Look, in this talk, what I want to do is just highlight some of the new technologies that are coming through, and I really want to focus on what they mean for Australian agriculture. And I want to also focus on what do we need to do right now to make sure that we actually capitalise on those technologies. And for each one of you, I want to ask the question, right now, are you going to be the beneficiaries of these new technologies, or are you going to be the victim of these new technologies? And at the end of this talk, what I'm going to suggest is that that's going to be up to you and that's going to be your choice. But you could end up, if you do nothing, being the victim, not the beneficiary. Before I do, I want to speak a little bit about Rurdoch and who the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation is. Rurdoch is one of 15 RDCs, and together the 15 RDCs role is to invest in research and development, which is practical, which is tangible, which can really make a big difference on individual farmers' paddocks in terms of productivity, in terms of profitability, in terms of sustainability, and in terms of the communities in which they exist and improving those. When you look at the 15 RDCs right across all agriculture, forestry and fisheries sectors, that partnership between the R&D levy, which is paid for by growers, and the federal government, that partnership, we're investing something like $800 million. That's $800 million a year that we're investing in R&D, new innovation, and getting that innovation adopted. In terms of RERDC, our responsibilities are for the industries that don't have their own RDC. So we look after industries like rice, like chicken meat, honeybees and pollination, recently tea tree oil, ginger, but industries that are paying a statutory levy, but for whatever reason too small or didn't want to have their own RDC, we look after those industries. We also look after, with the support of the federal government, we look after what we refer to as new and emerging industries, and some examples of that would be crocodiles, for example, goat's milk, truffles, but a range of new and emerging industries. Some of them, for example, natives, Kakadu plums. And our goal there is to see how quickly we can get these how quickly we can accelerate the development of these new industries, so that we're creating value for all rural industries, but also creating alternative or different options for growers on their farms. And finally, we're mandated to look at issues which might run across a whole range of different agricultural sectors. So we invest in issues, for example, that might help good policy to be developed by industry and by government. So recently, for example, we did a study into tax arrangements and the various tax options, looking at what the implications, what the impact would be of different tax arrangements on rural Australia. We also invest in and help ensure there's good information sharing, collaboration across RDCs in areas like climate change, for example, soils, and biosecurity. So there's a range of issues which run right across industries which we get involved with, helping to coordinate. And finally, we are involved in programs where we're trying to build the skills and build the leadership capability of rural Australia, and in particular the event we had last week with the Rural Women's Awards. And this event today is very much within that mandate of trying to build the leadership skills that will take rural Australia further. So one of the areas that fit in that area of being cross-sectoral is what we call our National Rural Issues Program. And what we're doing here, and the rest of my talk is going to be as a consequence of some of the investments we've made in that program. We hear a lot about transformative technologies, and what we felt in RERDC was that it's really important we define what they are and we try and get something around them, and so we can have a decent conversation about things like digital agriculture. I mean, we need to actually be talking the same language. So there's two projects that RERDC supported, which I'll be talking about, which will be talked about over the next couple of days, are projects that we've sponsored. One is in relation to actually developing up some fact sheets, so transformative technologies fact sheets, which we're actually launching at this event today. And the second project, which will be presented by Daniel Tyrrell after morning tea, will be looking at some work that RERDC sponsored with Deloitte, which is looking at technologies that are emerging, not in agriculture, but in other sectors, and then asking the question, what impact might they have on agriculture? So just to give you some context, this is some work that RERDC did in partnership with CSIRO last year. We looked into the future and said, what are some of the megatrends that are likely to affect Australian agriculture? And we came up, and there was basically 5 megatrends identified. The first one is globally a hungrier world, and I think Alistair, you touched on this, and Mike, you touched on it too. But the projection is that we'll have 9.5 billion people by 2050. The issue is we'll also have half the amount of agricultural land, and we'll have half the amount of water. So the question is, how do we feed that sort of population increase with less water and with less land? So there's a real challenge there. A wealthier world, and again, Alistair, I think you mentioned this, but the growth in the middle class, particularly in China and particularly in Southeast Asia, that change in their requirements. The move to a much more meat-based diet has incredible impacts on a country like Australia. Choosier customers. Customers want more information about what they're actually eating, and Sean, you covered that beautifully. And that's the reality. That is the reality of our customers, is they want to know what they're eating, and they want to know where it's come from. They want to know that it's being produced ethically. And that's putting increasing demands, but also opportunities on Australian agriculture. A bumpier ride. We've talked a bit about climate change already, but you just got to watch the commodity markets and see the movements that are occurring in prices, having come from the grains industry at the moment. You know, chickpeas were up, right, $1,300 a tonne. Unbelievable. Never heard of it. I think they've fallen back a bit now. And wheat and the starches and the cereals falling right away. I mean, that's what we're going to expect. I think that's what we'll see more of, is this incredible vulnerability, not just in the climate, but also in the markets and the prices that we receive for our goods. And being able to cope with that is going to be really quite challenging. Finally, of course, we've got these transformative technologies. Whenever I see the word transformative technologies, being an optimist, I always think, oh, that's great, that will solve all the rest of those problems, so we'll be okay. And I want to put you today, that may be well true, but also we all know, and we've all seen the victims of new technologies as well. And I just look in Australia at the moment at the taxi drivers in Melbourne, and they're certainly not a beneficiary of some of the new technology that's entering the taxi industry at the moment. And they are struggling, and I guess our challenge is to make sure that we're on the Uber side of that equation. So really, in this talk, I'm going to highlight some of the technologies, and I'm not going to go into them in any detail. The detail is in your folders, and a number of times during this talk I'm going to say to you, look, really encourage you to read those thoroughly. If there's one thing you do as a consequence of this workshop, is read through those 8 technologies, understand those 8 technologies, and ask yourself the question, what's it going to mean for me on my farm? That's the key outcome I'm looking for out of this particular presentation. And these are the technologies. Now, it was a hard call to know exactly which technologies to include, but at the end of the day, we needed to narrow it down. We needed to narrow it down to 8. And these are the 8 technologies that we've put into the fact sheets. And each one of those technologies has the impact to substantially disrupt Australian agriculture. And one of the things in going through that process of developing those 8 fact sheets, and I'd like to, at this point, acknowledge Victoria Taylor from Flourish Communications. Victoria and her team put a lot of effort and have done a fantastic job of developing these fact sheets. When you put a fact sheet together, it's often, the risk is that you very superficially touch a topic, and Victoria hasn't done that. Victoria's actually given us a good definition of what these technologies are in those fact sheets, but she's also then gone on and given us some of the case studies, and some of the case studies, some of the people that are in those case studies are actually in the room today and will be presenting later during the workshop. And she's put it in terms in which I think when you read through them, you'll see that you'll be able to relate to it in terms of what it means for you on your farm. To me, the absolute key here is, if you don't want to be a victim of these technologies, if you want to be a beneficiary, you're going to have to start right now in terms of planning what you're going to do on your farm, what you're going to do differently as a consequence of knowing these technologies are on the way. Each of these technologies is likely to impact on Australian agriculture in the next 5, 10 or 15 years. And most of these technologies are at least starting into the commercialisation phase. There's a couple of themes, though, that run through all of those technologies, whatever they are. There's some themes that will, in terms of how they'll impact Australian agriculture, which I'd like to highlight. The first one is each of the technology, when you look at the technologies as a whole, they all change the scale at which we think about farming and managing farms. So typically we've managed farms at the paddock scale, we've managed livestock productions at the herd scale, and a lot of these technologies are now allowing us to get a much more precise measure on what's actually happening taking us down to how individual animals are performing, particularly with some of the new sensors and some of the new monitors. And in the case of the plant-based industries, and particularly in horticulture, tree crops, taking us down to the individual plant and monitoring its performance. And that's allowing us to find, you know, we talk about precision agriculture, but these technologies as they emerge are probably taking us even down further into the level of detail and scale in which we can operate and in which we can manage our businesses. The second theme that comes through these technologies is that we can farm two things. We can farm from a different location. We can actually farm remotely, and we will see ourselves increasingly in an environment where we are able to share information much more freely amongst our advisors, amongst the other players in the value chain. And I think increasingly, and this is really very much, I think, coming through from you, Sean, in your presentation, increasing that, sharing that information with our customers. And that raises some real issues, I think, in terms of how people feel about that. But I look at it and I'd say, you're not going to have a choice. It's going to happen. And it's how you cope with it and how you actually manage that. That's going to be the critical things. But these demands are coming. The technology's there. You're probably sharing a whole lot more information than you realised now anyway. That's just likely to accelerate. The second impact I want to mention is that these technologies are all about, I guess the potential of these technologies are all about being more precise with our inputs, so reducing our input costs. And because we can more precisely position our inputs, allowing us to also increase our yields. So there's some real benefits associated with that, I guess, with that precision in the way we do our job. That's a result of having better information, better algorithms, and better ways of actually being able to manage farm data. I guess farming during my career has been very much about observation, getting out there and having a look, driving around, taking some samples, and getting a feel. And I would put it to you that with these technologies, as we're seeing in other non-agricultural sectors, moving much more towards analysis of data, collection of data, interpretation of data, to make better data-based decisions as opposed to anecdotal observations. So in terms of, are you going to be a beneficiary or are you going to be a victim? I would suggest there's a couple of things that you need to do right now. And the first one is to start looking at your planning. We're talking about technologies here that are likely to impact on your farm in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And that might sound like a long time. I can assure you it is not, and I would suggest to you for those technologies that are likely to hit in the next 5 years, if you're not planning for them now, you will be a victim, you will not be a beneficiary, you will be a victim. So getting in there now and looking through those, even if your starting point, even if you just walk away with those fact sheets, look through each of the 8 technologies and say, well, which one is most likely to give me the biggest bang for my buck on my farm? If you just did that and then started planning to get that technology into your farm, I think you'll be right in terms of being a beneficiary. But the technology is also likely to change other aspects of your business. The first one is going to be just in terms of your farm layout. So if you look at some of the technologies like your robotics, and if you look at some of the technologies around virtual fencing in animal businesses, if I was in your shoes, I'd be thinking right now about how your farm is laid out. Is it laid out in a way in which you can easily automate or use autonomous vehicles? Have you got lanes? Have you thought about safety? Have you thought about how you might separate people from some of these machines? And as you are redoing fences, or if you need to redo fences, you might be knocking down fences. Be thinking about how this technology might actually impact your farm layout, because it will have an impact on that. The second area where it's likely to have a big impact on your business is going to be in the skills you need to run your farm. those low to medium skills jobs are the ones most likely to be targeted by robotics, by automation. The chances are that your workforce will need to change quite significantly. The level of skill will need to probably increase. You'll probably need less people. You'll probably be farming or managing a much larger area. So some thoughts into the sort of skills you have at your access, and if you haven't got the right skills, how you're actually going to get them. And you think about now 5, 10, 15 years, it could take you the full 5 years to actually get the skills that you need for some of these new technologies. So it really is something to be thinking about right now, not in 5 years' time when your neighbours have actually started implementing these technologies. And the other issue is there's a real possibility, in fact probability, that with each of these technologies you're going to need to invest in capital, not labour. So again, have you got the access to that capital? Where are you going to get it from? How are you going to start planning to have access to some of the capital you'll need to be able to actually be a beneficiary of these technologies? And again, put yourself in the shoes of your neighbours all doing this and you're not being able to do it. Where's it going to leave you in terms of your competitiveness? Think about your international competitors if they are accessing these technologies, and if we're not in Australia able to access technologies, where that's going to leave us. So being ready and understanding that it's going to require capital, I think, is absolutely critical in terms of planning for these innovations. And finally, just be aware that it may be a lot easier for you to manage your business much more remotely than what you currently are. And I think that potentially opens up a whole range of opportunities for you in terms of where you locate your businesses, and whether you locate them all together or whether you actually locate them over a geographic area. What your spouse might be doing in terms of their career and where they need to be located for their career and still being able to run a profitable business. How are you going to do that? Well, some of these technologies, I think, will really open up some opportunities in terms of where you're located and still being able to run a successful business. So there's some of the opportunities and some of the challenges, I think, at the farm scale that the 8 technologies present. They also present some challenges at the industry scale and at the government scale. So I guess one of those challenges is the fact that we have a number of different new technologies that are actually converging. So in another sector, I mentioned Uber before, and Uber's transformed, absolutely transformed how people get around. But you put that together now with the convergence of autonomous vehicles and autonomous cars, Uber autonomous cars, it's going to be incredible to see how that actually impacts and what that does to the way people get around. And it opens up enormous challenges for regulators. So if you saw all the disputes down in Victoria over just Uber, you imagine the sort of regulatory issues that are going to arise when we actually have autonomous cars running around roads, and as we saw in the US, when you have an accident, what it means. These are all issues which we're going to have to confront in agriculture, getting the regulation right. And again, I just say to you, I know how long it takes to get legislation through government. 5 years is short, not long, to be able to get some of the regulations we need. But we need to start now in terms of understanding what they need to be like, and start talking at our industry levels about how we're going to get those changes, how we're going to get those regulations through the system in time for us to be beneficiaries before our competitors overseas are. The other challenge we've got is just getting the infrastructure in place. It's just so obvious at the moment, everyone here would know, but you look at wireless internet access in rural Australia, huge. If we're going to be beneficiaries, we have to have some of this infrastructure in place. It costs lots of money. It needs to be done together. It's not saying any one individual can afford. To me, that investment in the infrastructure required for these new technologies is a real stumbling block, which hopefully we'll hear a bit more about. Some good news, hopefully, this afternoon. Scale of agriculture. So some of the new technologies, if we compare agriculture to other sectors, so if we compare, for example, agriculture to mining, mining has, if you look at West Australia, they have autonomous dump trucks running most of their mines. They've got autonomous diggers digging the coal, the iron ore out of the ground. They've got scale. They're big companies. They've got the scale to be able to buy what they need and put the infrastructure in place and make it happen. And I guess one of the challenges for agriculture, particularly where we have small businesses which are based on individual farms, is the scale to be able to invest, to be able to access the technology. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, for us, is working out how we do that. And then finally, public perceptions. And if you look at technology, for example, up there, gene editing. Gene editing is different to GMO, where we're not actually introducing a foreign gene into the plant, but we're actually looking at very carefully changing a sequence within the existing genome. But that's going to take a whole lot of work in terms of how that's perceived by Sean's wife and by others in Bondi, in terms of it being acceptable, being safe, being ethical. So there's considerable work that needs to be done to just make sure we've got the public coming on this journey with us as we adopt these new technologies. So I just put it to you, we are looking at technologies in the future, and Mike, you've challenged us to look right over the horizon at what might be coming. My challenge to you is, what are you going to do when you go home on Monday? What are you actually going to do on your farm when you go home on Monday? What's the first step? You know, long journeys start with that first step, and I'm putting it to you, there's urgency here, and if you don't make that first step on Monday, the chances are for every day that you don't make that first step, you're pushing yourself towards the category of being a victim of new technology, not a beneficiary of new technology. So later today, we've got Daniel Tyrrell from Deloitte is going to talk about new technologies that are coming out of other sectors and what impact they might have on Australian agriculture and how we might be able to capitalise on that. We've also got a number of the case studies that are in those booklets. We've got some of the people that are in those case studies presenting. We've got Catherine Evans, we've got Nick Wright, and we've got Darren Lee, who will be able to tell you exactly what they're doing with these technologies on their farm. So hopefully that will give you a little bit of inspiration. So please enjoy. If there's only one thing you do as a consequence of this conference, go home, read those fact sheets, ask yourself the question, what are you going to do on your farm as a consequence of those new technologies that are coming over the horizon in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And ask yourself, are you going to be a beneficiary or are you going to be a victim? Thank you.
I just want to know from the group, are there any points of clarification from Sally and Sean and Alistair and John? Any things you want to understand a bit further? Any questions you want to ask? Okay, I got one down the middle there. Just stand by. And the reason we want the microphones is so that we can record the questions. We can hear you, but we're sort of recording all of this to embarrass you later.
So we've seen a few times the 2% digital IQ thing, how Australia's behind. What is a digital IQ?
Alistair, that was your point, I think. Who wants to answer it? What is a digital IQ? Who said that? Was Sean?
Yeah,
it was Sean, not Alistair.
I read it out of Alistair's paper.
Oh, you read it in Alistair's paper? Yeah. It's gone back to you, mate. You've got to answer this question.
Can I say, I don't know what it is, but I sure want more of it.
Well, I mean, just intuitively, I think it's just a greater understanding of digital technology, digital IQ.
2% doesn't sound that far behind, but we would picture ourselves as being further in front than the average, wouldn't we? So it's actually an interesting statistic. it's sort of like we're average. That surprised me. I thought we were in front of that. Mm.
Can I actually ask you a question, John?
Please.
We're going to hear a lot about the data drought over the coming days. Are there any transformative technologies on the horizon that are likely to compress data or do things like that that will close the gap, that people in the bush will have a service at least comparable with what people in the city have?
Righto. So there's a couple of parts to that question. Some of them I'm not going to try and answer. In terms of access to internet and all that, I think when NBN talk this afternoon, that will be a much better opportunity for them to explain where that's up to, because that's, to me, that's such a big hurdle right across the whole of Australia, is getting good internet access. It really is at the moment I guess it's the stumbling block for a lot of farm businesses. But there's certainly, and Darren, you might talk a bit about this, I think, when you talk this afternoon, but there's certainly better ways of actually collecting data, so sensors, and they've certainly progressed in terms of their technology, but also how cheap they are becoming, and that's really, really important. But more importantly, I think, is better ways and algorithms for actually understanding and interpreting what's been recorded and what it means in terms of farm decisions. And in some technologies where and if you read the one on artificial intelligence, being able to respond to those sensors and react and for example, in an autonomous vehicle, as a consequence, change course, change in action. Some of the work, for example, Sydney Uni's doing with fruit trees, being able to actually identify fruit in an apple orchard, being able to actually identify its ripeness, and it's only one small step then to actually the robot not only identifying the fruit and the ripe ones, but then actually picking them. But that ability to actually take in the data, use the algorithms to actually understand what it means, interpret it, and then automatically have a response is, I think, where a lot of the technology is making big inroads and will have huge impacts on Australian agriculture.
I guess I've got a question for you too, John, and I guess it revisits probably your key point, which is, are we going to be a victim or are we going to be a beneficiary of technology? And, you know, I think Kodak is a fantastic case study of that. You know, for those who don't know, Kodak actually invented the digital camera in 1975. And they went bust in 2012 because they didn't roll it out and they didn't embrace it and they didn't believe in it. I guess with this captive audience here today, John, what do you think is the best thing that they can do to prepare now to make sure that they are going to be a beneficiary and not a victim?
Yeah, read those fact sheets.
That's too
really,
easy.
to be, as a starting point, is to go back, look at your farm, ask the question is, what are the opportunities on what do these technologies mean first? Understand the technologies, really understand what they do. Look at the case studies, look at people like Darren are actually using the technologies now and how it's affecting their business and their decision making. And then ask the question, you're not going to be able to look at all, you're not going to be able to do all 8 of them, but look at those technologies and look at other technologies, ask the question, which is going to have the biggest impact on your farm, beneficial impact on your farm, and then go for it. Start learning everything you possibly can about that technology and start planning to implement it, even if it might still be 5 years out before you do the first step. Start planning out what you're actually going to do on your farm to actually make sure that technology benefits you.
John, can I ask you just one more question? We live in an era at the moment where the political narrative is as much about paying down the national debt as it is nation building. So what sort of pressure are the RDCs under to show value for how they spend the taxpayer's dollar? And is there a danger of you picking winners rather than projects which come with more risk but potentially could deliver greater benefits?
Well, the RDCs are rightly always under pressure to show that they're delivering value. I've got no problem with that. We should be. We're not only under pressure from the federal government, and with tight budgets at the moment, obviously we are under scrutiny from the federal government, but we're also under scrutiny from every one of our levy payers, and so we should be, to make sure we are making the right investment. I guess we do pick winners. We have to pick winners. I'm a great believer in actually focusing investment on the things that you think are going to make the biggest difference. I'm really loath to go down the track of being the spreader of Vegemite and keeping everybody happy by doing a little bit of everything, because I don't think you do get the impact that way. So yes, we do have to pick winners, but then as RDCs, we've got to be prepared to make the hard call, which is to say at some particular point in time that this is going nowhere, we've got to get out. So in hard and out quickly is my motto on that one.
Okay, last question down the back. Laura, you have one, then we'll break for morning tea.
My question's for John. When we look at disruption, as we've been talking, Airbnb has disrupted the the hospitality industry. Wasn't started from within the hospitality industry. We look at the transport industry disrupted by Uber. Wasn't disrupted by people in the transport industry. We look at the disruption that's happening in cars and how they work. That's not being disrupted by Toyota. It's being disrupted by the likes of Uber and Google. And when we look at farm technology overseas, a lot of the great stuff doesn't actually come from within agriculture. It comes from outside the sector. So my question is how do Rurdic engage, or are they engaging, and other RDCs engaging stakeholders from outside agriculture, because we're great navel gazers in this industry that we all passionately believe in, and who are we engaging, and what kind of talent are we bringing in from outside the sector to bring in some fresh thinking and essentially disrupt our own sector?
Yeah, man of my own heart. I totally agree with what you've said. And one of the things, and the next speaker, Daniel Tyrrell, will specifically address your question about what technologies are emerging in other sectors and what impact might they have on Australian agriculture. But I just want to add to what you're saying, because that's really important. We look at these other sectors, mining, banking, whatever, and see what's happening there and ask the question. But we also need to be looking overseas at what's happening in other agricultural countries. And we need to be seeing what they're doing and bringing the best of their technologies, best of their expertise back into Australia. And particularly, this is my personal view, we need to be looking very much overseas at what's happening in the private sector, particularly US. The majority of the investment in R&D is being made by the private sector. When I was with GRDC, we did a deal with Bayer to bring technology into Australia. We spent $45 million. And we've got Bayer now focused on developing herbicides for Australian weeds, Australian conditions. As a consequence of that, looking at what's happening in the rest of the world. So other sectors, yes, absolutely, and Daniel will talk about that. But just as importantly is what's actually happening in all the other countries around the world, and do we have our network strong enough, and are we at risk of reinventing the wheel where we don't need to? It's a really, really good point that you make.
Okay, thank you everybody. We're going to wind up for morning tea.